Josh, so here we have a situation where jobs and industries are migrating to Mexico because labor costs are lower there. Of course, that means more profits for the people who own these companies. Can that change?
Look, I think it's worth putting this jobs issue in a particular perspective. Yeah. I mean, taking the $880,000 net job figure as a given, you know, it's important to think about this in the context of the US economy. Approximately 2 to 3 million people involuntarily lose their jobs every year. So if you talk about sort of over a 20-year period when NAFTA has been into effect, you know, there's been approximately, you know, maybe 40 million people have lost their jobs. The economy probably created another 44, 45 million people. So there's net job growth. There's enormous churn in the US labour market. So what we don't know about the 800,000 people who lost their jobs is, did they find jobs elsewhere? And this is really the crucial challenge for the United States. I mean, in many respects, a good trade agreement will lead to job losses because what you're trying to do generally is create more competition, inefficient industries die, you create new opportunities in new sectors, and what you need to have is a mechanism in place to allow workers to take advantage of the new jobs. And the US does not do that well. There is not a good comprehensive set of policies in place to help workers transition from industries that are dying into industries that are growing. So it's not really a trade policy issue per se. I mean, trade policy should be driving these types of outcomes. What we really need is a more comprehensive set of labour market policies. This is a labour market challenge in the United States at root. We've got 4.4% unemployment, extremely low, but there is a large cohort of people in the US who have dropped out of the labour market for a whole variety of reasons. There is nothing that can be done in terms of tweaking trade policy, whether it's renegotiating NAFTA or whatever, that's actually going to fundamentally get at the jobs challenge in the United States.
Ambassador, if we look at this, I mean, how much of this is political? Because President Trump complains about the fact that jobs, especially in the auto manufacturing sector, have been lost to Mexico. Since 1994, America has lost 2/3 of its auto jobs, while Mexico has quadrupled the auto jobs, as you've been telling us. Are those jobs going to be returning to the United States?
I don't think so, especially if you raise content in the auto sector to the North American market, because it's going to make the vehicles much more expensive. You can see what's already happened as a result of NAFTA, particularly in the last decade of NAFTA, where the paradigm changed dramatically in terms of how our production and supply platforms became integrated. The big difference is that President Trump talks about job loss and trade deficits, but out of every dollar that Mexico exports back to the United States, 40 cents of every single dollar of Mexican exports are US content. You don't see that anywhere else in terms of US trade relationships on the face of the earth.
Right, right.
So that's a unique facet that we've seen develop in North America, and which could be scuppered by some of the politics that are driving the way the US is approaching some of these very important issues.
Yeah, let me get Carlo's view on that. Carlo, Canada has also seen growth in the auto industry. Supporters of NAFTA say that North America has become one big supply chain. You get parts made in one part of these three countries, which cross the border, used in assembly lines in other parts. Doesn't that make North American manufactured automobiles more competitive in the international market?
Oh, certainly. You have the ability to specialize production, go where you have the ability to produce things not only more cheaply because of labor, but more productively because of specialization of labor. Mexico has invested a great deal in terms of upgrading job skills and productivity. Obviously, they were starting from a lower point than Canada or Mexico, so they had much ground to make up. But we've all become more competitive. And that car part, or that car that goes back and forth across the border 5 to 8 times, is a symbol of how competitive and how integrated the industry is. You wouldn't move parts back and forth across the border 5 or 8 times just for the heck of it. There's got to be a good business reason for it, and that is to make cars more efficiently and more competitive. It's also not just cars. If you look at beef, cattle are raised in Alberta or raised in Saskatchewan. They're taken to the U.S. for time, and then they're processed in either country. So we have integrated supply and production chains in things that people even wouldn't think about, like beef.
Celeste, how confident, sorry, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, what's not being said here is that that's all true. But what we do know is that Mexican workers in the auto supply chain, they're as productive as American workers. They've got state-of-the-art factories there, just like we have in the US and they have in Canada. And if it's only about productivity, you know, economic theory says workers' wages are supposed to rise when they're getting more productive. And yet, in the manufacturing sector, Mexican workers have seen their real wages fall by 20%. So it's absolutely true that we can put in rules that put incentives on companies to make sure that they're sharing the gains with workers. It's not just about, you know, the number of jobs that have been lost. It's about the impact on the economy. And if there's a game of wage arbitration that's really preventing workers from raising their standards of living, and when you go to an auto manufacturing plant in Mexico, you can look at the parking lot, and the workers can't afford to buy the goods that they're producing the way workers in Detroit who are UAW members can. That makes a difference. And if we want to sell more, then we need to help create middle classes in Mexico and our other trading partners. And we start with putting more rules and more strict rules on labor rights and taking away special corporate privileges like private courts for foreign investors.
Josh, what do you see?
It's interesting when
Go ahead.
American workers have been given a choice recently in, I think it was South Carolina, whether or not to unionize, a free vote, obviously in the United States. They chose not to. So I don't think it's as black and white as it's being made out. Workers in the U.S. and Canada and Mexico are also making choices. You don't have to work in the auto sector. You can go to work in other areas in Mexico, aerospace, things that are also competitive.
And it is true that there is a wage differential, but one of the important success stories that you've seen in Mexico over the past 20, 25 years is that slowly, this doesn't mean that extreme poverty and inequality and polarization of income aren't a problem, but you've seen an expansion of the middle class in Mexico over the past 10, 15 years, which is changing a lot of the dynamics, not only in the labor market, but also in terms of economic well-being. Having said all of this, I will be the first one to underscore that the three governments, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, over the past 20 years have done a lousy job of creating the safety nets for those workers who do lose jobs either because of automation or changes in production, and how those safety nets have been developed so that people who are left without a job can be retrained, can find a job. That has been one of the problems that we have faced. But it's not a problem directly related to NAFTA. It's a problem related to the social economic policies of each one of the three countries that have not been put in place over the past 20 years to take into account some of these economic dislocations that have occurred in the labor force.
In part, it's related to NAFTA because NAFTA sets out a box, a set of rules that the NAFTA countries have to make their laws and regulations comply with. So there are opportunities for companies that want to move their investment around to challenge various laws and protections for working people, for the environment, all kinds of things. So if we take away those special privileges for corporations to sort of get at democratic attempts to say, we need to help our workers, our environment, improve our laws, then we could have more creative safety nets and other things for working people. So what you're saying is correct, but trade and NAFTA in particular plays a role, and we can look at that role and fix it.
Okay, Josh, I'm going to get to you. We've got a few minutes left. Looking broadly at these negotiations, they're now underway. What do you see as the main challenges facing the negotiators?
I think we're going to have a series of broad political challenges and some specific substantive challenges. I think that what we still don't know about the current Trump administration is how they are ultimately going to square their rhetoric on trade with the realities of what you get in a trade negotiation. How do you ultimately deepen integration amongst the North American market and convince your base that you're bringing manufacturing jobs, etc., back to the country? I mean, I think it's a very blunt and incorrect tool for trying to achieve what are genuine challenges in the United States. I think substantively, there's a whole range of new issues on the table. As I said before, there's a lot of experience amongst the North American countries with some new trade issues as a result of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation. Canada's put some new issues on the table, for instance, Indigenous rights and women's issues. There's updating that can be done even beyond the TPP. So I think there's a lot of learning that's going to have to happen well beyond just sort of a focus on manufacturing sector, jobs, services, digital, state-owned enterprises, transparency, labour, environment. And I think as a result, we're going to see a fairly drawn-out negotiation.
Ambassador, the Mexican economy minister was talking about these talks, and he said they are going to be tough, they're going to be long. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Hay incentivos alineados.
There are aligned incentives so that we are able to conduct very clear negotiations with precise objectives, and there are elements that allow us to see paths, which have been already walked, that can lead us to solutions in many of the issues that are important for the modernization of NAFTA. We also know that there are difficult issues to process that will lead to tougher and longer dialogue.
So tougher, longer, very quickly. I've got 30 seconds, unfortunately. What are the biggest challenges that Mexico
Well, look,
faces?
I've always thought that you should never let a crisis go to waste. We had a crisis that was unleashed by President Trump taking a stab at NAFTA. We can really end up with a modernized 21st century standard, gold standard set of rules for trade. I think that by bringing in the new TPP chapters, that's going to be an important issue. But we're going to have two challenges. One is the clock. We've got a presidential election in Mexico next July. We've got congressional midterms in the United States in November. TPA expires in July, Trade Promotion Authority by the US Congress. And on top of that, you've got the threat of President Trump's tweets and statements that could derail or contaminate the negotiations.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us.